we have a couple speakers to talk more about EPS alternatives, and the first is Jack Macy from the City and County of San Francisco. And Jack is currently the Commercial Zero Waste Coordinator for the City and County of San Francisco. Jack has 24 years experience implementing policy and programs for composting, recycling, and waste management at the U.S. There's a typo here, at the U.S. state and local level. Prior to his current position, he was the city's organics recycling coordinator, where he helped initiate and implement the U.S.'s first large-scale urban commercial and residential food composting program. And he is currently on the board of the California Organics Recycling Council. Jack assisted in the implementation of local legislation requiring compostable and recyclable food service ware and the ban of supermarket plastic carryout bags in lieu of reusable, compostable, or recycled content paper. Welcome, Jack.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Clyde. Well, hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn what's going on and applaud all the. It's exciting to hear how many of you are pursuing plastic bag bans and EPS bans and how far we've come in just the last few years. Actually, I wanted to say that our plastic bag ban has been a model, but people have gone well beyond that. And we actually have a proposed ordinance to expand ours beyond the supermarkets and pharmacy chains to all retailers and add a 10-cent charge. So I hope we'll do that. We're just working out our CEQA strategy, but we'll be following the latest great models that are going on. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. I'm going to indulge a little bit about I have a few comments to make about not just the product end of things, but sort of how we approached our ban. And let's see here. So basically, this was the. I think I skipped. Okay, here we go. This is what I wanted to. All right. What I want to say is. This is the outreach piece that we did originally. This is actually the latest version of it. But our ban that went into effect in June 2007 was targeted to all food vendors. It was for food that was prepared in San Francisco, and we have a pretty large food sector. So we came up with a list of over 4,500 food establishments, restaurants, cafes. So I guess it's about 10 times the size of Fremont's food sector. And it was kind of like, how are we going to manage this? Basically, what we did is we did a mailing to everybody, and kind of looking at Oakland's model because they had done something similar. They had done a food fair, and we thought, that's good. And we thought, how do we really want to control what food vendors, restaurants buy? So who do they buy from? Well, they buy from distributors, whether it's a retail wholesale distributor. Like Restaurant Depot, or whether it's one of the many vendors. So what we did is actually went and worked with them, and basically what our ordinance does is it banned expanded polystyrene, just the expanded part. There's a good argument for both, but ours had two components. One was a straight-out ban, no ands or ifs, and then the other part was it must be compostable or recyclable. And we did have a food collection program. And I think you should have one, or should be in the process of implementing one if you're going to require compostable. Otherwise, it could end up in the landfill. There's issues with that. So we basically, it was compostable or recyclable. But at the time, back in 2007, we weren't accepting rigid polystyrene containers, cups or containers, or PET cups and containers. So in effect, at the time, we were banning all polystyrene. But then it was, if we ended up accepting that for recycling, which we do now and have for a couple of years, it narrows it to just the expanded. So we did basically, our outreach was sending a mailing to everybody, and in that mailing we told them about the ordinance, and then we said we have these foodware fairs that we want you to come to. And what we did is we worked with the distributors to make sure they understood what was recyclable and what was compostable, and we invited them to come to the fairs and showcase their wares, but we wanted to make sure that they were showcasing the right stuff. And so we really worked hard on that quality control to make sure they understood. And if they understood, then the restaurants are not going to necessarily be buying the wrong thing, hopefully. It's challenging when they're like a restaurant depot at the time where they service more than San Francisco, so they have the right products and then the wrong products. So, but that strategy actually worked pretty well. The outreach, we did some door-to-door. We ended up having, it was at least 5 foodware events around the city with several hundred. I think we ended up figuring it was maybe around 10% of the restaurants attend, which is not a big percent, but it was those restaurants that were particularly interested and concerned. And then those vendors were now well-educated, having worked with them and gone to those fairs. So the biggest part of implementing this has been sort of twofold. One is communicating this to the restaurants and the food vendors, not just that initial outreach, but we have actually ended up going door to door to over 4,000 restaurants. Now, I didn't do that because that would be pretty expensive to have staff. We were actually able to get a number of volunteers to become styrobusters. Big shiny, tag. No, we didn't actually have the sheriff badge, but they went out there and it was really quite simple. They had a checklist and they would go in and they would look around and if they couldn't see anything, they might ask, what are you using for takeout ware? And if they were using any styrofoam, they said, well, you're not allowed to. This is a courtesy visit. Here's the flyer. And then they went on into a database and they said, someone's going to come back and check with you in the next few weeks or a month. And so after that point, it might take longer, a volunteer would usually come back, and if they were still using it, then they went into an enforcement list. Our ordinance writes in the city administrator's office, and we actually set up a system where restaurants would get, food vendors would get a warning, and then we would make sure that they stopped using it, and if not, they actually got citations. So we've actually had a few hundred, 200-300 fines going out, and this whole process of sort of doing that enforcement, once the fines go out, they had an opportunity then to say, we really have stopped using styrofoam, so they didn't, not all of those paid it. But it was that process, mostly volunteers, some staff time, that has actually helped us reach so many and helped us achieve that, what we claim is a 98% compliance rate based on the over 4,000 that we visited. So the key challenge with beyond sort of all that outreach has been to determine what is really acceptable or not. The recyclable, is more straightforward, although that's expanded. But the compostable has some issues. So one, of course, is any kind of paper or plant fiber material. That is generally straightforward, although we do accept a sort of the very thin poly coating, in terms of paper cups and certain paper containers. So that gives us a lot of flexibility. What we like to say is almost anything out there that is not, at this point, and this is the truth, almost anything that's out there that's not styrofoam is acceptable, so you have a lot of options. And the paper or plant fiber has worked in the composting process. This is all based on what is acceptable in our composting program and in our recycling program, and that can vary over time. So that's why it's important in the ordinance to sort of say, what is currently acceptable, and then the city is going to maintain that reference point on a website or something. So paper and plant fiber, generally straightforward. What I like is sort of this bagasse, the sugar cane. It's basically sugar cane waste. It's a pretty ecological, low footprint type product, composts well, and it has some good properties in terms of heat retention. We do find, though, that the poly-coated paper probably overall has performed the best in terms of replacing styrofoam, particularly in terms of keeping a moisture barrier. The styrofoam the EPS has its advantage of being, one, the cheapest thing out there, and two, it does perform well in terms of insulation. So you've got that challenge to look at what the use is and being able to provide a number of alternatives. So compostable plastics is another area that we've accepted, and this has been where it's been more challenging for us. How do you know it's really compostable? Well, in our experience, it's important that they meet a standard, and we've been able to verify through a lot of testing over the years that standard works at the compost facilities that we work with. But there is an ASTM D6400 standard specification for compostable plastics, and we want to make sure that they meet that standard, because there are so many claims in this area where products actually don't meet it, even if the vendor that's selling it might really truly believe they do. Look, it passes the biodegradability test, and ASTM D5338, well, that's not the same, even though it's part of, the D6400 standard has a set of 3 different tests. Biodegradation is one, disintegration is another, and phytotoxicity is another. So it's got to be D6400 and nothing else. Well, how do you know they meet that? Well, they can show you a lot of lab data and get pretty confusing. You don't even know if the lab followed the right stuff. So having it actually independently certified by a third-party agency, we find really helps. And that agency in North America is the Biodegradable Product Institute. They have a website, bpiworld.org. You can go and you can actually verify a product's on there. And they can also show you the certificate if you want. Through our experience, we're actually able to help get state law to basically make it illegal now to use the word biodegradable or degradable on bags, cups, and foodware because there's such abuse of that term. So if you see a cup, or a foodware with degradable, biodegradable being sold in California, it's actually against the law, and you can just say, not going to accept it. So use the word compostable, and state law now backs it up. But for us, it's not just ensuring that they meet that standard, but it's actually being able to identify the difference between compostable and non-compostable. So we've struggled with the whole labeling issue on that, and we find that just the embossing of the word compostable on the bottom of a cup, where you have to kind of hold that cup up to the right light, catch it just right, you might see it says compostable. Not going to work very well for a user, even harder for the collector, and even harder for the processor that might have a conveyor belt of stuff going across, and they just can't grab all that stuff. So the green labeling that you're seeing on cups, we actually helped develop that about 6 years ago with the largest manufacturer of compostable cups, and trying to get everybody to use it. And most of the time we're seeing that it's out there, but we still see cups and so forth without that, and it's unnecessary. It makes it a lot harder to deal with. So identification, as I said, is key, and having stuff that you see here on the left of the screen, where it could be PET, it could be polystyrene, it could be it could be polypropylene. Without good labeling, it's really hard. We've got good labeling options for bags, and we actually got it in state law. Cups, we have readily available opportunity to print. But going beyond that in terms of clamshells, it's hard. So this is a real, I think, disadvantage on a practical level from the collection and processing as well as the public end when you can't do effective labeling. And at this point, if we see a container that says compostable on it, and then with the PLA, polylactic acid from NatureWorks, we know that's all good. That's good, but again, it's hard to identify on a collection and processing end if it's just a clear embossing. So we keep pushing that. Don't like the way it's labeled on the left. Do like the way it's labeled here on the right. And you'll see one of the examples is there's even a sticker. So we try to get one of the biggest manufacturers of compostable, the PLA clamshells, to put stickers on all that stuff. And they even came up with a design. But then to get the vendors to pay that a little extra, maybe penny or two, is tough. So we've had this sort of journey now for years dealing with the labeling, identifying, and it's still a challenge. And some of you may have been at the U.S. Composting Council conference just a few weeks ago in San Jose. Curious, I know a couple people there. Richard was there. So there was on that Wednesday, there was a whole day-long symposium on compostable plastics. And there are all these issues and concerns and challenges, particularly from the composter's perspective. There are composters out there that just don't want this stuff, whether it's met the certification or not, or they don't necessarily trust the ASTM standard because they read the standard and they see it takes 180 days, and they're like, well, our composting process takes 60, 45. They might not understand the science behind it that shows that it really does fully biodegrade, and the issue is more that it doesn't disintegrate fast enough. So there's a standards issue. There's the organic certification issue, NOP standards from out of USDA and DC. Technically, the stuff is considered synthetic and is not allowed, so that's a whole issue. And then the labeling identification. And that's all to say that it's just not an easy slam dunk. Oh, it's compostable plastic, no problem. It'll end up in the compost facility and no concern. So this is something to be aware of, and this is really why, in some cases, it's almost, if you can have if it's a clear cup that has to be used, it has to be a clear cup. In our case, because we're recycling the clear PET and polystyrene, it's almost easier to have that clear cup go into recycling. It's clean enough to go for the markets, although it ends up, of course, going to Asia. But, as far as we know, it's getting recycled. And then, cutlery, well, that doesn't really get recovered off the MRF line. So if it's compostable cutlery and it goes to the compost facility, well, it'll get composted. but is it really compostable? One of the most common used cutleries out there for the last few years has been taterware. Guess what? That's got maybe 30% polypropylene. Is that compostable? Absolutely no way. And the history with the taterware company, can't trust them. So they just refuse to go through the certification process, and they just say, trust us. You've come up with taterware D6400 to say that it meets a D6400. Well, that sounds great. Let me see the test that show that you've met the complete D6400. Well, just, we don't want to have to pay for all of that. Just trust us that it does. Well, come on. So anyway, that's the challenge with cutlery. And I think, the good news is that there is more and more cutlery that performs well, because there's been issues with that, and is fully compostable. An example of that is the stuff from World Centric that's out on the table out there. So we're actually seeing progress now with products performing better, more and more certification. The list of certified compostable products just keeps getting longer and longer, as well as our lists of stuff. And we used to list all these brand names, and they became really unwieldy, so now we don't list it. But this is just to show you that on a practical level, if you're going to have something that's compostable or recyclable, particularly around the plastics, you want people to understand which goes where, and it's got to work with your collection programs. There was questions about events. It's actually in our event areas where we started using compostable plastics, the compostable cups. And that actually helped an event go from almost no diversion to 75, 80, 90+% diversion. And again, trying to communicate that mostly through images we find works the best. Kind of like the customized actual products you see on the bottom there. And that was a Green Mary setup who does great jobs at the events. And here we have front of the house. This is where we're headed in San Francisco, because this is an example with the hospital in San Francisco. And that is because not only do we have this foodware ordinance that requires food vendors to use just compostable recyclable, but it's a requirement now in San Francisco that everybody, whether you're a resident in a single family or multifamily, whether you're a business from a small restaurant to a large establishment, office building, whether you're a visitor, everybody has got to sort into 3 streams. And just about 90+% of everything that's being discarded now is recyclable or compostable in most of our programs if you're doing a food collection program. So the opportunity is great to divert the material, but we've got to watch out with some of the challenging issues on the foodware side. Clearly, if it's foodware and it's got food contaminated, it makes sense for it to be compostable, because it's hard for that stuff to be clean in a recyclable end. And that basically, we have the fiber opportunities, and then we have the compostable plastic opportunities and challenges. So we feel like we've come a long way, and this ordinance is working really well for us. The next step when we think about a EPS ban is we've got it banned at the food service level. Well, why not ban it for anybody who's buying products in the city? Because you can still residents can go to a supermarket, they could go to Costco, and they could buy their styrofoam cups, and it can end up in their black bin. So we'd love to expand that to all, and that's on our agenda, and as well as along with the foodware ban, and we have other ideas as well. And I know Mariam, who's up next, will talk about the reusable cup idea that we like as well. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
We have some time at the end for some questions for the speakers, so we'll bring Jack back up. So next we have Mariam Gordon, again, from Clean Water Action, and she's going to talk some more about some alternatives to EPS packaging. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, if we're talking about banning polystyrene foodware, I guess a major question is, what are the alternatives that would be acceptable? Should we specify acceptable alternatives in these local and state policies? And so I've been thinking about that for quite some time, and I wanted to share some of those thoughts. So what are the alternatives? Well, there's non-foam polystyrene, there's polyethylene, there's paper and molded fiber, bio-based compostable plastics, which we've been just hearing about, aluminum, glass, reusable, and let's not forget the reusable ceramic, glass, and plastic containers. So, which is best? And how do we know? Well, the answer is that it depends. It depends on what benefit you want. So, what are you trying to do? What problem are you trying to solve? Are you trying to solve the litter and marine debris problem? In which case, you really need to just focus on the foam, because that's the stuff it's lightweight and it breaks down into little pieces and it's easily dispersed. Are you trying to increase recycling and diversion, which is what most local governments are doing, because that's the way our integrated solid waste management AB 939 system is set up in California. That's why compostables make sense, because it helps us increase diversion. Most food contaminated plastics aren't all that recyclable, as we've been hearing, so that may not be so easy to accomplish. But we're all environmentalists here too, right? We care about public health and the environment, so we also want to find options that protect public health and reduce environmental impacts and maybe even promote green design. But how you arrive at the answers really depends on a couple of things. One is what's the research behind, who's funding the research behind answering those questions? So sustainable packaging is a whole field that's been going gangbusters in the last few years, and in the absence of government standards for defining what is a sustainable package, the industry has really stepped up to the plate. The consumer products industry that has to choose the packages for their products, as well as the packagers. And they're doing this because there are a whole bunch of drivers. There's the extended producer responsibility for packaging laws that are 33 countries have required take back of packaging waste. And there's also the whole movement for green chemistry and green design. So responding to regulatory pressure and consumer pressure, the industry has started to both define, not started to, but is well on the way to defining sustainable packaging, and also creating the research and the metrics behind answering those questions. So there's an array of definitions and tools for what's a sustainable packaging. In the United States, I would say that the biggest sustainable packaging program or definition comes from the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. They are primarily a very large industry group that emerged from the Green Blue project of the McDonough Cradle to Cradle group. And then there's also others around the world. There's the UNEP Sustainable Packaging Program. Some companies like SC Johnson Company has their own set of metrics. Walmart has developed a sustainable packaging scorecard. In Australia, the Sustainable Packaging Alliance has developed their own system. And another interesting group was started by I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the product group, but an NGO, Clean Production Action, started the Sustainable Biomaterials Collaborative, and as well as the Biz NGO Working Group on Sustainable Materials. So I'm not going to go through every single one of those, but just to say that the people who are defining sustainable packaging are the private sector, mostly retailers and brand owners who feel that they have to act more quickly and with more positive results than waiting around for governments to take action. And they also have a very strong interest in controlling the outcome of the definition of what is a sustainable package. Here's who is the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. I know you can't read that, but it's all industry, except I've highlighted just the few that are not industry groups. Michigan State University School of Packaging, but they receive their funding from Dow Chemical. And then there's the Rochester Institute of Technology. Not sure what industry funds them, but most of the academic institutions are funded by the chemical and the plastics industry at this point. There's our own State Department of Resource and our own Cal Recycle. And I think somewhere in here is the EPA and Stop Waste. And then there's the Western Michigan University. So, but, basically it's several hundred plastic packagers as well as consumer products companies. And so that's what's going on. That's the U.S., that's sort of that's becoming the standard sustainable packaging group and metric in the United States. In Europe, starting with Europe had a group of group of retailers that have to comply with the EPR program there. They started their sustainable packaging guide, and so we can see that a lot of the same companies that are in the Sustainable Packaging Coalition in the United States are part of European, and they are creating the European metric, which is called the Global Packaging Project. I think if you were really interested in finding out about sustainable packaging and looking at an alternative perspective, you might take a look at Clean Production Action's Biz NGO Working Group on sustainable plastics. Just wanted to throw that out there. And they have a project that's specifically looking at biomaterials and trying to develop some other standards for what is a sustainable biomaterial. I think from participating in that working group, we're seeing it's not so easy. But there are all kinds of different approaches to evaluating what's a sustainable package. There are design guidelines for designers of packaging. There are regulations. There are scorecards issued by companies like Walmart and the SC Johnson Company, where if you are a retailer and you want to be able to sell through, if you're a consumer product manufacturer and you want to sell through one of these giant retailers, you have to go through their scorecard and actually your package has to score adequately. But at the base of almost all of the metrics, there are life cycle analysis tools and software, and there's just a whole bunch. In my attempting to answer the question of what's the most sustainable packaging alternative to expanded polystyrene, I've learned that there are a lot of metrics out there, and a lot of tools. Different types of tools, packaging design tools, packaging procurement tools, and life cycle analysis tools. I'm not going to bore you with the gritty details, and I'm certainly not an expert on each one of them. But just to say that what I'm seeing from sitting on in various stakeholder groups, national stakeholder groups, the key metrics in play right now being used to determine what's a sustainable package is the Walmart scorecard and the Sustainable Packaging Coalition's Compass tool. That's in the United States. In Europe, there's, as I said, the Global Packaging Project, which comes from European. Now, there are a lot of issues to consider in evaluating these life cycle analysis tools. If you want to look at a life cycle analysis that compares, say, a paper plate to a polystyrene plate, you have to find out what assumptions went into that life cycle analysis. Did it look at the life cycle of that product from cradle to gate? In other words, from extraction of the resources till the product was complete in the manufacturing state? Did it look at it from cradle to grave, which would be from, as you all know, from the extraction of all the resources to manufacture, through the manufacturing and into disposal? Or did it look at it from cradle to cradle, which looks at it from the extraction of resources all the way to the end use and back to its being remanufactured into something hopefully beneficial? So they're all different kinds of LCAs, and they look at different phases. And, you might want to consider whether if you're looking at a package, LCA, did it look at all the additives, all the chemical additives that were in that package, or did it only consider the base materials? So there's just like a whole lot of complicated stuff that goes into figuring out what LCAs to rely on. And then also, as the industry likes to point out, we also have to look not just at the package, but the influence of the package on the contents, like how well. 5 minutes, okay. So mostly my point is that it boils down to life cycle analysis. All the metrics and scorecards rely on it, and they're only as good as the data input. And there's incredible variability in the results depending on these data inputs. I'm going to skip. Here's an example. There was a life cycle analysis of a glass versus a plastic baby food jar done by Nestlé's for 3 markets, France, Spain, and Germany. It looked at it was a cradle to grave analysis, and it concluded that the plastic jar was slightly preferable to glass, but there were many assumptions that went into that life cycle analysis. The energy used was based on the natural gas grid of the EU, but not necessarily specific to any one of these particular countries. The transportation impacts were, can vary very much from one country to another, depending on the load requirements for trucks transporting goods on highways in each country. Then there's the distribution distance, which can vary greatly, and the packaging collection rates that go in for recovery of packaging. And what about the efficiency of the incinerators that might be used to treat the waste in these countries? Those are very variable. And the recyclability of the multi-layer polypropylene cup can also be very, very variable. So whatever assumptions went into this, they probably weren't customized for each of those markets in France, Spain, and Germany. There was another life cycle analysis one more example that I wanted to point to, because I think this will be really instructive for us in considering maybe compostable and bio-based foodware and comparing. So this was an LCA on 12 different types of plastics. And so it compared polyethylene, high-density polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, polycarbonate, polyvinyl chloride, general polystyrene, and then 2 forms of polylactic acid, PLA made by NatureWorks, and another PLA. And then 2 other plastics made from corn grain, PHA and PHS, which is a polyhydroxyalkanoate forms. And lastly, there was BPET, which is a petroleum hybrid bio and petroleum biopolymer. So 12 different types of plastics, and they came up with this LCA assessment, life cycle assessment. Now, if you take a look at the green, the dark green and the light green lines, those represent how PLA, the 2 different PLAs, which is corn-based plastic, rank in terms of their green design. They rank very low in terms of their fossil fuel use and global warming potential. But they rank very high in terms of their carcinogens, in terms of ecotoxicity and eutrophication. And what that tells us is that, because this is corn and it's a major ag industry, there's a lot of fertilizer use, pesticide use, and land use impacts that result from all this agricultural production. And so, we often assume that bio-based materials, bio-based plastics are better because they're made from renewable resources. But I think the point here is that just because you're using a renewable resource like corn instead of a non-renewable resource like petroleum, it's not necessarily a net environmental benefit. There are still trade-offs related to the use of harmful chemicals on crop and energy emissions in the production and use of fertilizers and pesticides. So that's, we need better principles around the use of renewable resources when we consider what's a sustainable product. If you look at the very light gray line at the end, that's polypropylene, and it seems to have, of all of them, some of the lowest impacts. But remember that this is just a cradle-to-gate life cycle analysis, so it did not consider the impacts of disposal and recycling, and polypropylene is not very recyclable. So the point is that in this study, they used two different measures, two different types of LCAs, a green design version and another version, and with each of these 12 polymers, they came out with very different rankings. So my point is that it's a very subjective, what is a sustainable package, and it really has to do with what kinds of environmental benefits you're looking for and what are the inputs in terms of the information. With bioplastics, I just want to say that I have always felt that the jury is out on whether this is a good way, if we should be moving all of our packaging waste and 30% of our municipal solid waste being packaging waste, whether we should make this all based on renewable resource materials. I think that there are questions like the impact of bio-based materials on recycling and the toxicity. We don't know, with the chemical additives in those plastics, we don't know what happens to the plants that are grown in soils that have all those chemical additives being added to them. So are you confused about what is the most sustainable package and what are the best alternatives? Well, I am too. I'll just have two quick closing slides, but I will tell you that the industry perspective, and I am sitting in some stakeholder groups with the largest consumer products manufacturers in the country, Target and Walmart and Colgate, Palmolive, and General Mills, and they're all controlling these tools. They are all developing these life cycle analysis tools and metrics, and what they are telling us is that we have to be looking at the whole package and the product. And if we want to avoid product loss, like packaged fruits and vegetables being wasted, then we basically need to use more packaging. And that's how they are beginning to define sustainable packaging. And they're also telling us that flexible packaging, this is the new term for plastics, flexible packaging, a lot of their life cycle analyses funded by plastic resin manufacturers are showing that plastic is the sustainable package. I'm not convinced, and I think it's really suspect when millions or billions of dollars are being spent by the industry on these tools and life cycle analyses. But what I do know is that prevention and reuse makes the most sense because, it avoids all of those life cycle impacts. A ceramic mug used 1,000 times requires 3 pounds of material inputs and creates 4.7 pounds of solid waste, while an equivalent 1,000 polystyrene disposable cups uses 12 pounds of material inputs and creates 8.7 pounds of solid waste. And the same can be said for a steel spoon versus a polypropylene spoon. A lot fewer impacts with the reusable items. So I want to encourage you, when you're thinking about what are the appropriate alternatives, not to jump to the conclusion that to ask questions about bio-based materials and not to assume that renewable resources are better. It's really worth investigating what the impacts are and to consider actually focusing your efforts on promoting reusable products. Thank you.
We'll take some questions. You want to sit down here? So we're going to have Jack come back up, and we're going to take some questions for Mariam and Jack. And whoever wants to go first, Phil.
Question for Jack. Could you talk a little more, Jack, about what San Francisco is looking at? You mentioned possibly restricting, banning the sale of styrofoam products in stores, if I heard you right. And then also, so if you could say where you are in that, how likely you think that is to happen in San Francisco, and how soon. And then how about expanded polystyrofoam packaging? Any thing you're considering doing there?
Yeah, we had, we were kind of moving forward with the with when Mayor Gavin Newsom was still there, and there's been a change, although I think merely would be supportive. So we would like to expand the scope of that EPS ban to, you know, all sales in the city, and not just retail, not just vendor use. And, you know, for us, it's end of life. It's really end of life impacts. Although I think that there is, you know, toxic life cycle is another argument. But then you could say, well, rigid polystyrene that has a lot more polystyrene in it should be included. But it's easy for us to say it's got bad end of life impacts, and it's not recoverable in our composting and recycling programs. So that's why, you know, we're keeping it to just EPS. And I think, did I answer your both questions?
Well, I just wanted a time frame. Have you drafted an ordinance? You know, are we?
Yeah, we had a kind of a draft that's not public. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, hopefully we'll move on it this year. On the plastic ban side, there's an ordinance that's been drafted and introduced to the board. So I think we're ready to go faster there. And if we can just get agreement between planning and legal about where we are with CEQA, then I think that's kind of the holdup. And that was where I referred to expanding our ban of single-use disposable plastic bags to all retailers and putting a charge on paper. And the other thing about that is the biggest problem I've seen with our ban is that the loophole around the language for reusable bags, where this 2¼ mil durable plastic, you basically had plastic companies like Roplast come out and say, well, here, it's a 2¼ mil bag. And you know what, it turns out it's only about 5 cents. That's cheaper than paper. So suddenly these stores will say, well, then we'll use that instead of paper. And we were actually able to, you know, Walgreens, when the ban went into effect for pharmacy chains after the supermarkets, they came out with those reusable bags, and they use a lot, like 80 million bags a year. So we actually got them to change it because you're saying, well, we're going to change that. So why don't you be ahead of the game and really be green? But it was harder to change that because once the plastics industry took their suing strategy, we were a little reluctant just to open up the ordinance. But we ended up doing a regulatory change that we saw we could do to tighten the definition, but it's still problematic. We think the best solution is if you're going to put a charge on bags, there should be a charge on any bag that's provided, paper, reusable. Either you can sell the reusable bag or you charge it. There's no reason to give a free reusable bag unless it's a very limited promotion, because there's too easy way to loophole out of disposability. If you give something free, people see it as disposable.
The other one was just what about styrofoam packaging beyond food service? Is there anything in San Francisco?
You know, nothing specific. I mean, you know, that's a possibility. You know, part of taking these strategies is identify that there's readily available options out there, and there's many options to styrofoam foodware. There are options to. The biggest problem with styrofoam packaging is that if the legal authority we have in the city is we can say, you know, city businesses can't provide or sell, but you've got most of the styrofoam packaging is coming from, you know, outside the city, Asia and all that. So that's, I think legally it's much harder for us, or we can't even control that. And even though there might be some options there, so it's really the scope of our control. I don't see an easy answer to that.
We have some bunch of questions over here on the other side of the room.
Speak out of both sides of my mouth. Jack, you went into some description about the need for compostable packaging to have a green ink on it or some form. But I was wondering, in a curbside collection system, our green waste isn't pre-sorted and just if it was a non-compostable package, it would be screened out at the end of the process after it's been composted. So I'm wondering what the value is of requiring the green label if it's going to be accepted at the curb in a mixed collection system.
Yeah, well, I think there's several advantages. One, for the consumer, it helps them see that that's compostable, because otherwise it looks similar. They have to then look in the bottom, and they have to understand that a number 7 PLA is okay, but a number 7 non, I think there's a lot of confusion out there, so I think it helps the consumer. And it's easy to say, then it has to be labeled compostable with a green stripe. The collector, they see plastics in the compost, they're going to assume it's contamination, and they may tag it or not pick it up. And then the processor, most compost facilities, they don't want regular plastic going in because they pre-grind the material. So then you're shattering the plastic, and even with the screening at the end, it's hard to effectively remove all of that rigid plastic out. So most composters that take that kind of feedstock with food are going to try to do at least some pre-screening and even sorting.
Question?
Hi, this is for Mariam. As we move towards more of this compostable food service ware, and we're finding out that a lot of it has plastics in it, is there any data that looks at what the ultimate compost is and what kind of land this can be applied to?
I'm not sure I understand your question, I'm sorry.
Okay, so let's say we do all these bans and we tell special events and businesses that you can only use now compostable food service ware. Because there's such variability in what the compostable food service ware is made of, and we don't have a lot of data on that, but we're still collecting it and giving it to compost facilities. So what is the value of this compost? I mean, if we don't know, if DTSC, for example, in one of your slides, doesn't know what the additives are in these products, are we still applying this to agricultural land? Is this, getting into the food production?
Well, yeah, we're applying soils that have compostable plastics that degraded in them we're applying that compost into our food growing system. And I guess that's the question for me is, so what happens to the additives, which we're not exactly sure which ones they are because they're trade secrets, it's hard to know, but we know from traditional petroleum-based plastics that there, are hundreds of different types of plasticizers and chemical additives, some of which have been shown to be endocrine disruptors and carcinogens and have all kinds of health effects. So let's assume, I would assume that some of those same types of additives are being used in bio-based plastics to give them similar properties, colorants and, things to prevent preservatives and fumigants and all the same sort of stuff. So if those additives are in there, what happens to those additives when the plastic material breaks down in the compost setting? Do those chemicals disappear? Do they remain in the soil? And what happens with crops and food crops when they're grown in soils that have these chemical additives in them? I asked the state to study that several years ago when I was consulting for the state, and they ended up commissioning a study done by Chico State to look at to look at bio-based plastics, but they ended up only studying whether these bio-based compostable plastics meet ASTM standards, and they also, in terms of the toxicity question, just looked at whether or not the compostable plastics inhibit plant growth. And they found that they don't inhibit plant growth. But that still doesn't speak to the question of what happens to those chemical additives, and are they being taken up by the plants that are our food crops.
So we're actually scheduled for a break right now, but I'm going to ask the speakers to stay up here. So if you have questions, feel free to come on up and ask away. And we'll be back in 10 minutes, so it's about 10 after 3.